Hi everyone, I'm Natalie, part of the Empowered Scotland team, and on our No Problems Here podcast today I have the lovely Beth Morrison who's going to be telling us all about Callum's Law. Hi Beth, how are you? And thank you so much for coming on and chatting to us today. Could you just tell us all who you are and all about Callum's Law? We'll just get started with that.
Yeah, sure. Hi Natalie, thanks very much for asking me to come on. It's a pleasure. So Callum is a young adult now. Callum has epilepsy, he's got cerebral palsy, he's autistic, learning disabilities and sensory processing issues, which, a lot of our children have. And after, a kind of tumultuous time at primary school, we thought we'd won the lottery when, we got a place in this all singing, all dancing, brand new special school in Dundee. And so Callum started there in 2010. It's quite a long time ago now. And he was fine for the first 6 weeks. And then we had a meeting and they said, he's going into an enhanced support area. So it was like an upgrade almost, to have even more support. At the time, Callum didn't have a lot of language. He really struggled to process language. And one day they were in the gym hall and he was riding a special adapted disabled bike. And he didn't understand the teacher's instructions. And when, in her words, he refused to come off the bike, the report said that she pulled Callum off the bike and then he kicked her. Don't condone that, but, it's a perfectly natural response to somebody pulling you off a bike. And that resulted in 4 members of staff taking Callum face down on the floor in a so-called floor hold prone restraint. They basically crushed him so he couldn't breathe. He wet himself, and only then did they stop holding him. And they picked my child up. He was very small at the time, wore clothes for a 6-year-old. And then they strapped him down in a chair, still in his urine-soaked clothes, and they stood over him with an egg timer to show that he was being punished. Callum's injuries were really quite extensive. He had over 60 bruises on his little body. He was actually taken to the hospital. All these injuries were recorded. The doctors actually said to me that they thought they'd have to prepare for court because they thought it was abusive. So anyway, cut a long story short, there was a police investigation that took absolutely no action. Nobody was ever held accountable and didn't sit right with me at all.
No.
I had no idea that they could do this to children.
Especially your own child, any children, but when it's your own baby, it's horrendous.
And especially because what I've come to know is it's the most vulnerable children. It's the kiddies with disabilities, with autism, neurodiverse conditions, and they've all got very severe communication difficulties, Natalie. And I don't think any of us would do that to our own children at home. Wouldn't do it to any child.
We wouldn't get in. Also, can you imagine the backlash if we did? Not that we would want to, but if we did, we would be held accountable for that. So it shouldn't really be any different at all if it's a member of staff and somewhere doing that to a child.
And my husband and I were utterly devastated that this could happen. Callum, of course, was completely traumatised. He didn't want to go back to the school. He started having nightmares. It was really a very dark time in our lives, thinking back to that. And one of the things that I started to look at was, well, what is the guidance? Because nobody had ever said to me, if Callum has challenging behaviour, then he could be restrained. He could be put in a room on his own. Nobody had ever said that to me. So I started to look for guidance and found there was none. There was absolutely no guidance whatsoever in Scotland that said, this is what they can do, this is what they can't. So I thought, well, if we've got no guidance, then we have to have it. So in 2015, PA 1578 was in the Scottish Parliament. So I had a parliamentary petition. There was something like just under 5,000 signatures on this parliamentary petition. And there it stayed for 8 years. We had a set of guidance in 2017 that was frankly useless. 2 pages that said absolutely nothing, would protect nobody. So I then started to become very, very vocal and say, you know, why is this happening? Because I was becoming vocal. More and more parents were beginning to contact me to say, this is happening to my child. My child's been restrained. My child's got bruises. My child, I had broken teeth. I had broken noses, broken wrists, broken ribs, broken collarbones. And these were all little kiddies with disabilities. And it was all hidden. So I began to think about this. It was like a dirty little secret. And time went on. Then Bruce Adamson, the Children's Commissioner, our last Children's Commissioner, got involved. And he did a formal investigation. And in 2018, he brought out a document called No Safe Place, which was aptly named because, you know, children are supposed to be safe in school. But in fact, for many children, they weren't safe in school. So No Safe Place was published. The government said, oh, no, we've given you the guidelines that we did in 2017. We're not going to publish anything extra or anything else. And the Children's Commissioner said, well, you know, we don't agree with that. And in 2019, the Children's Commissioner took the Scottish Government to court. They did a judicial review, and the Scottish Government then said, okay, we will do rights-based guidance. I was invited onto the panel who was writing the guidance. That was in 2019. Children's Commissioner was with some other people. And for 5 years, we sat on this group. 5 years we were writing this. And in the summer of last year, we were told that we had to sign off on the guidance, despite the fact that we had the UNCRC recommendations that were in Scottish law, enshrined into Scottish law in July last year, 2024. And the guidance did not comply with the UNCRC, because the UNCRC had made very specific recommendations over what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. So, for example, UNCRC said, abolish the use of isolation rooms. And we know that that's not happened. We've still got children being locked in, shut in rooms. I'm afraid I call them cupboards because they're generally very small. There's no windows. Very often there's no heating.
Children fancy names often given to them.
Yeah. We've got blue room, calm room. We had sanctuary, the den, all these wonderful names that hid the reality that our children were being carried, forced into these rooms, because you don't imagine that if your child is so disruptive that they have to be isolated, do we really suppose that they go in there meekly, calmly? No.
It's going to escalate the behaviour, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, kids are frightened. Of course, you've got that fight or flight response, and it's really horrific.
Well, as an adult, we would feel completely threatened by that. So it's understandable for children, obviously, to be as well.
Yeah, and we're in 2025, and I've had, this is across the UK, but I'll give you the breakdown, Scottish and English and Welsh and Irish figures. So from all over the UK, I've had families since 2017, when I started to keep records, 6,000 families. That's 6,000 children. From all over the UK that I've kept records for. Just over 3,000 of those children are in Scotland. 33% are just 6 years old. In the last 3 school years, I've not had a single case in Scotland involving a child over the age of 9. This is a problem for primary school. I'm not saying it doesn't happen at all in secondary. I've just not heard about it. But it is little children. So from as young as 2, I actually had a 2-year-old in a nursery who was restrained because she didn't want to take a nap along with other children. So they just held her down.
It's not okay at all.
No.
And do you find when people are coming to you, is it sort of specialist provisions this is happening in mainly, or mainstream, or a mixture of both? Or where do you find that most people are finding these,
well, Callum,
problems isn't even the word, but where is this happening mainly?
It's both. I mean, Callum's experience was a special school. But remember, in Scotland, although we don't have very many special schools, whereas the whole school is a special school, we have more and more ASN units being part of mainstream. I mean, I'm going to say something quite controversial here, that I think that in mainstream, what I found, just going to meetings with families and what have you, that mainstream staff seem to want to think out of the box more. It seems to me that restraint and forced isolation, seclusion, is generally more widely accepted in an ASN environment. It's just what they do. So actually, to be controversial, because, I hear people saying, well, that's what happens when children go to mainstream. Actually, personally, I think the mainstream staff appear to do better because they think differently. But we still have a very big problem in Scotland, and it's little children.
Yeah.
The other thing I think that I'm really noticing in the last year or 2 is that a lot of these kiddies that were born just before COVID or around COVID are all going to nursery and to school now. They don't have the socialisation. We've got CAMHS waiting lists as long as your arm. In fact, I was told yesterday that in Tayside, the waiting list can be as long as 8 years for a CAMHS appointment.
I mean, I've heard 3 and 4 years, but 8 years is just...
Well, this
what
lady
happens
this lady had already been waiting 4, and she was told it could be another 4, so 8 years. And we're just not... A lot of these kiddies just are not ready to go to school. The other impact is that if you have a child aged 4, 5, 6, now, chronologically, they're of the age where they go to school. That's just what we do in this country. They go to school at 4, 5. If you're lucky and you can keep your child back a year, then 6. But cognitively, especially if they've got a disability, these children are very often functioning and operating at an infant level. So what I've found is it's the children that are the most vulnerable, the children that they can't speak. They've got very severe communication difficulties. They don't process language at the same rate as other children. They don't understand complex instructions. They're operating at, a year, 18 months, 2-year-old level. And we wouldn't expect a child of 18 months to 2 years old to go to school, sit nicely with their feet on the floor, ready to learn. That doesn't happen. And I don't think that's being recognised. So why did we decide to do Callum's Law? You can see I'm wearing my crown here. And
I'm supposed to have mine, but I'm just telling it as it is. My daughter broke it by accident, so my glasses are to represent my support of Callum's Law, okay? It was the best I could do.
So the reason why I'm wearing the crown is I think that we all kind of think about the crown as in the establishment of the crown to represent the justice system, to represent the laws of our country. And, in November last year, the Scottish Government guidance, IEI3, I think it's called now, was published, but it's not statutory. And although there's some really good things in there, it doesn't comply with the UNCRC recommendations. And it means absolutely nothing in real terms because it doesn't offer our children protection in law. So hence the crown. I wear the crown because I think the crown must protect our most vulnerable. And if that means that we have to enshrine their rights in law, which we've done in Scotland already with the UNCRC, or that's what we've all to believe, we cannot then have a situation where our children are going to school or to any child service setting, whether it's a nursery, respite, whether it's an after-school club, where the rights are not upheld in law. So Callum's law is asking for the guidance to be made statutory so that children have legal protection. We want mandatory recording and reporting because they don't have to record these things, Natalie. They don't have to report them to anybody, so it all remains hidden. We want a duty of candour almost to inform parents, because the only reason that I found out Callum had been treated the way that he had been treated was when he came home injured. Nobody from the school called me and said, this is what happened. And that is what I'm finding with a lot of the families. They don't know.
So was Callum, sorry Beth, was Callum left in school like that the rest of the day until he went home?
Yeah, and they put him on the bus and sent him home.
After being unconscious?
Well, he was, by the time I got him home, Natalie, his urine-soaked clothes were in a plastic bag. Just, there you go, on the bus. He was wearing clothes that weren't his. He had no underwear on. He had no socks on. His shoes were soaking wet. His lips were blue, and he collapsed in my arms when he came in that day. Within 15 minutes, he was in the doctor's surgery, and it was the doctor that said, we have to get Callum to hospital. Natalie, I've got an expert witness report that said the injuries Callum had were normally seen only in restraint death. So this is dangerous.
No,
Callum could have died that day. And
it's obviously what's gave you, because one of the questions I was going to ask you is, being involved in any fight and campaign, it takes so much out of you. And obviously you've been in this for so long, but I'm assuming anyone, that is your drive. I mean, what you went through and what Callum went through and what all these other children are going through, it must be what motivates you to keep going and keep fighting this, because it's like you said, it should never be happening. And in 2025, and with things like UNCRC, you would be expecting that there's a lot more protection of these children. And I think people.
I was just going to say that I think that one of the realizations I've come to is that if this was to happen, and as you said earlier, if this happened in the family home, we'd be held accountable, because what happens in our family home is subject to child protection. What happens in school and in a professional setting, it's safeguarding, and they're not the same. They don't have the same status in law. So child protection, if you're subject to child protection in your home, if you did that to a child, the police would be involved, social work would be involved, and, you'd be held accountable. You'd have your child taken from you.
Yeah, and I'm just mind-blown, though, that a child was left in school after that happening. And again, in 2025, or even at all, it just shouldn't be happening. But now you would think that it's like, no, because I know that from speaking to people, I have mentioned, because I've followed you for quite a while, Beth, and all your work, and you're the queen of campaigning, and that's it, that the crown shows that. And I've told people before, you can see people like, no, surely not, that doesn't happen, that can't happen. You're like, it does. It's a thing.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I've really tried hard to do, and one of the reasons why I think the Crown is such a powerful campaign tool, because you know that I ask supporters to wear a crown. I send crowns all the time.
I feel really guilty now about my glasses, but I have got a picture that we put on Twitter and
Yes.
Facebook and everything with the crown, so I have done it, but today I'm sorry.
Yeah, and it is to take a photograph and, you know, say, I support Callum's Law, and we share it on social media because it's raising awareness of these things. Because you're absolutely right. When this happened to Callum, I thought, what? No way. Because to the best of my knowledge, he had never been treated like that before he went to the special school. And when I took him out and he went to a mainstream school, a mainstream high school, he was never treated like that again.
How did he get on? How did he manage to integrate back into school? So did he go back to the school that this happened in?
Yeah, that's something I'm going to have to live with for the rest of my life, because I was told I had to keep Callum there. There was no option but to keep Callum, and there was no other school in the whole of Angus or Dundee that could meet Callum's needs. And for 3 years, I kept my son there, Natalie. And for 3 years, Callum, every single morning, would strip himself naked, not wanting to put his school uniform on, anything to avoid having to go, anything to avoid going to that place. And he would beg, please, mummy, no, they hurt the children. But all the time, I was having regular meetings with this school, and they were saying, no, there's no problem. You know, no, I don't know.
Well, this is the name of the podcast, There's No Problems Here, and that's for a reason, for a good reason, because that's what we hear across the board with ASN, is whether it's somebody trying to get the school to do a backup letter for referrals or anything like that, no problems here. It's just, it seems to be the line that's used quite a lot.
And they actually said, are you sure there's nothing happening at home? That's like waving a red flag to a bull for a parent, you know, when your child is so traumatised that they can't go to school. And meanwhile, I was waiting in a CAMHS referral, and Callum had a breakdown. And it was then I said, right, enough is enough. So I decided that he was going to be going on a part-time timetable. Because that was another thing. See, when I asked him to leave that women's class, why? You know, well, why on earth would you want Callum to leave her classroom? Because she wasn't the problem either, apparently. We're trained to do this, they told me.
Trained to pin somebody to the ground. Wow.
Yeah, and we're allowed to do this. But in the end, one day, Callum by that time was only in school for an hour a day, an hour and a half tops. He went every afternoon, and one day I was taking Callum to school, and I was in the reception area, and I saw 3 staff slam a little autistic boy against the wall and restrain him. And Callum said, I told you, mummy, they hurt the children. And that was the day that I took him out, because I saw for myself. Until then, I'd been gaslit.
I think I might have needed restraint if I'd seen that.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it was behind a set of security glass doors.
I was going to say, I take it you weren't anyway, because that would have been really hard to...
No. And again, I contacted the police. I told them what we'd seen. Nothing was done, because it's allowed. It is allowed. And they do it. And they do it because they can. Just all of these kids, these little children traumatized by this barbaric method of control, because that's what it is. And I think it's really, really important to say that our children who need a lot more love and care, just a bit more than others, are not getting it. Yeah. I don't think, I mean, we talk about there's no money, councils are strapped, but Natalie, the only difference between the school Callum was at and the school that he ended up in Angus, a fantastic secondary school, was the staff and the attitude. Because The special school had everything at its fingertips. It had 2 swimming pools. It had sensory rooms. It had a disabled bike for every child in the school. It had, in the wintertime, they had a dry ski slope. They had everything. There was a fully staffed NHS medical unit. Every possible resource, yet they did that to my boy.
So outside looking in, to people, it looks like, oh, this is a wonderful school. It's so equipped. It's got all these,
everything.
I don't know what you'd say, bonuses, like, you know, all these things for your child, when actually it wasn't.
And when Callum went to Carnoustie High School, the staff were different. They gave Callum that extra love and that extra care. And without that, I don't know where we would have been.
Did you find that did Callum settle there quite quickly then when he went to secondary? Yeah. And no challenges in the morning getting him out the door or anything?
No. And that was how I knew Callum's okay, because he got up in the morning, got his bath, got his school uniform on. He was proud of his school uniform. And, you know, he got in the taxi and he went away every day. He came back and he was smiling, he was chatty. There was also an open door policy at Carnoustie High School. I could go into that school at any time and I could go straight to the ASN base and I would be welcomed.
Which is huge, just even for you to have that. And also for Callum, it just gives you that bit of reassurance and comfort rather than being kind of pushed away and not knowing what's going on. So,
and that is exactly it. There was nothing hidden. It was transparent. It was open. And the relationship that we had with the staff and the management was first class. And I've got to say, the staff there have really supported Callum's law. So what we want is for a law to protect our children. It's needed. It's in the UNCRC. Statutory guidance needs to be published. The abolishment of isolation rooms. We want mandatory reporting and recording. We want this duty of candour to inform parents when things go wrong. And Natalie, there's none of that is too big an ask.
No. And it's, again, you'd mentioned earlier on about funding and money, and you don't need money to stop holding down children.
No. I mean, I don't think we can ever put an all-out ban on the use of restraint. I don't believe in the isolation rooms, but I think that sometimes you do have to physically intervene to keep a child safe. And the guidance talks about last resort. And the problem is I don't think staff really understand what a last resort is. So a last resort to me would be holding a child back from running into the road, from jumping into deep water, falling out a window.
Anything they can put themselves at harm or risk with you.
Or, you know, if they are causing real harm to another child, for example. But I don't know if you've been aware that some of the teaching unions have been talking about violent incidents in schools. These violent, aggressive children that are in our schools and how teachers can't cope, and, you know, it's really, really awful. And they're releasing reports quoting stats. And I'm telling you, I see every single day these violent incident reports that are recorded by school staff. And very recently, I had a 5-year-old autistic non-verbal child who has a clementine every day for lunch. He can't peel the clementine. Somebody's got to do that for him. Yep. And this particular day, nobody was peeling his clementine. So he tried everything in his power. So he'd used all his behaviour skills to say, I'm struggling, I need help here, because that is the language of I can't cope. When our children are distressed, that's them saying I need help. So he'd used all that. And so what he did was he threw the clementine at the member of staff and it hit her on the head. Not ideal. The only thing that was bruised, though, was her ego, because what happened to the child was 4 staff pinned him down, one either side of him on a chair, one on his shoulders and one at his ankles. And that wee boy's bruises lasted for weeks. And that was recorded as a violent incident. Who assaulted who?
But what did they feel the purpose of that restraint is? If the clementine's already been flung, is it punishment?
I believe that we are now using, or staff are now using, physical intervention and isolation as a form of physical punishment. Yeah. So the only conclusion I can come to, we banned the belt in this country in the 80s, but yet for our children, being put in isolation rooms, being carried along the corridor, prized off their parent in the school playground to get them into school, restraining children, holding them down when they're distressed. And I'm not going to say that when they're aggressive, because if a child has to resort to physical methods of having their needs met, that tells me that the adults have failed. And that's another quite controversial thing to say. What we need to be doing is focusing on needs, focusing on meeting the needs of children, not surrounding them by staff to pin them down. No. We have to nurture, we have to love, bring love back for our children. Because, do you know what? A happy child doesn't challenge. A happy child isn't going to use aggression. It's not. Our children are the least likely to have their needs met in school. They're seen as very complex. You know, we don't really know what to do with them. They can't talk.
And that's when Beth, when they feel unsafe, then that's when, like you said, that's when you see the changes. You can see them spiraling from having obviously our own children. We know the cues. Do you think as well, if there was more training for staff on, other than the autism toolkit, more ASN training for staff in schools, that would sort of de-escalate some of these challenges in the first place?
Absolutely. And again, one of the asks in Callum's Law was, I said, okay, mandatory training for staff. And by mandatory training, what I meant was that the local authorities had to be forced to allow staff to have the time and the right tools to do the jobs that they love. Unfortunately, the unions are saying, we don't want anything that would force our staff to do training. We don't want anything that's mandatory. And that makes me sad, because we have to support the staff. We've got to give the staff the right tools, the right understanding to meet the children's needs, because, it's not about money. It's about understanding. It's about empathy. Yeah. And if we were able to give the staff the tools to meet the needs of the children wouldn't be anxious. They wouldn't be getting upset and distressed. And we wouldn't have these situations where children are, dare I say it, throwing clementines, throwing toys.
I'm sorry, I'm not laughing. It's just, it's not remotely ridiculous. Funny. It's when you're saying a violent incident with a clementine.
Mm-hmm. It's not a brick.
To grow a set, don't they?
Exactly. Well, that's what I'm saying. But it seemed to be, let's record that. But what they're not doing is recording when they do intervene. And Daniel Johnston, who's the MSP, who's taken Callum's Law to the Parliament for his private members bill, he talks about staff not having to record deliberate acts of violence and deliberate acts of holding a child down in these safe holds that actually aren't as safe as we think. Because there is training out there. There's restraint training. There's physical intervention training. But there are also studies that say that even when staff are trained, you can't prevent injuries. And again, controversially, I think if staff are trained in restraint, they're more likely to use it. Whereas if we train staff on how to...
de-escalation rather than restraining, basically.
Yeah, meet the needs, be proactive in the way that they support children. So at the first sign of anything at all, any kind of distress, you do that checklist. I've got a 2-year-old granddaughter, and it's really brought it home to me how vulnerable our children are. So if you've got a child who's 5 or 6, but functioning as a 18-month-old child, still in nappies, if I look at my granddaughter and she's upset, I go through this mental checklist. Is she hungry? Is she thirsty? Is she needing changed? Is she in pain? Is she bored? Is she overstimulated, understimulated? I go through that mental checklist. That's not happening in the schools. They're not doing that. And that's a very simple tool. This child's anxious. Are the lights too bright? Is it too noisy? Is it the environment? What's wrong with the environment? Is it the person supporting? Is it the activity? Is it too hard? Is it too easy? Does the child need a break, a sensory break? And we're not looking at the whole child. We're not meeting the physical, emotional, and the sensory needs. And, the sensory needs are a whole other podcast, but it's something that we can train staff, and we can give staff those skills that they need to prevent these kind of situations escalating to a point where they feel they have to hold a child down. Let's face it, 2, 3, 4 adults are no match for a small 5 or 6-year-old child, because my stats tell me it's those children. I think something like 27% are 5, 33% are 6.
Very young.
Very young. I mean, I think I'd need to double check, but I'm sure we've got like 10% or 3. What are we doing?
It is mind blowing, and it is. I think some people listening to this will be quite shocked. I do think that people are shocked. I mean, it's nuts. It's awful.
The advice I always give to parents when they contact me is, look, the first thing you need to do is to get a copy of your child's school file. See what's in there. Have there been any incidents that you don't know about? Some schools do record, but you've got to be able to read between the lines, because the Clementine incident, nowhere in the report did it say it was a Clementine. It said it was a weapon. So this kind of fluffy language that we're getting, I mean, there's cases that have been in the press recently, and the language that is used is, frankly, hiding the reality.
This is the thing as well, though. It's obviously to say, violent incidents or violence can look like a whole different thing. It's so broad. And it's like you're saying about the recording. It needs to be recorded in a way, was it an ASN child that wasn't able to verbalize something and something happened, or was it, there's very, very different ways of how that can look. And like a weapon, to me, I automatically would think like a knife.
A knife.
Yeah, I would think a knife. Not a Clementine really wouldn't be up there with what I would automatically assume a weapon was. And I think a lot of people would be the same. Yeah. Beth, I've got a couple of questions here for you, if that would be okay. So it'd just be good to know sort of what resistance that you've been met with from schools, Education Scotland, local authorities and Scottish Government. And with an incident like Callum's, there should have been a national rollout of consistent state practice. That's not the case. So I'm assuming you've had quite a bit of pushback.
Yeah. I mean, in the early days, when the police, for example, investigated, Callum wasn't the only one in that child. There were multiple children involved in a investigation called Operation Downton that was done by the National Child Abuse Investigation Unit. It went nowhere. And they said that our children were unreliable witnesses because they couldn't speak, they couldn't be interviewed, and that needs to be looked at because, again, if it happened in the family home, you know, children would be interviewed by a specialist. That didn't really happen in our cases, so that was pushed back, and it felt like, well, you know, my child was able to say who it was and when it happened, but very little else. He couldn't be cross-examined in court, so that felt like a major pushback. The other thing is that in local authorities, what people aren't realising is that if you're lucky enough to get social services to do a safeguarding investigation, remember that social services, those people who are investigating, are employed by the council. So that is one council employee investigating another employee by the council. There's no independent oversight, and that's a problem. So again, that's pushback. I don't think the Scottish Government really understood way back in 2015, you know, how bad the situation was. So yeah, they definitely did resist. They pushed back.
No problems here.
Yeah, no problem here. You know, that's it. And I do remember the civil servant saying to me, "Oh, but you know, we'll monitor the effectiveness of the guidance," and that's something that really worries me because they've produced the new guidance. They produced it in November, and they've said that we will monitor the effectiveness of the guidance, and we will review it in a year. How are they going to do that? How are they going to review the effectiveness when we've got no mandated recording? They don't have to record what they do. We don't have to report it anywhere. So are they going to engage with the families? Oh no, that's not what they do. So how are they going to test its effectiveness? They're going to ask the schools. Schools aren't going to say, oh yeah, we've got a problem because we're constantly restraining children and putting them into the cupboards. So I don't really believe that the measuring of the effectiveness is good enough. So again, that's another pushback. What I think we need to be doing is to be listening to our Children's Commissioner. The Children's Commissioner, like me, has had so many cases. You know, families getting in touch. They know just as well as I do. They've done No Safe Place. We know there's a problem. And the guidance, although, yes, I helped to write it, but I didn't sign off on it because it didn't comply with the UNCRC. It's still not good enough. It's still not statutory. It still doesn't say that they have to record and they have to report. The pushback from government is huge. The pushback from schools who are using these methods is huge. Other schools support us. I've got so many staff who've said, I've had teachers who have wore their crowns and they've shared their social media, their photograph on social media wearing their crown. So I think that there's a lot of teachers and a lot of staff that do get it, and they need the help. They need the clarity. They want the training. Every time I do training in autism and behaviour, I've got a teacher sitting in the room. And I think it's time to do the right thing.
Well, I've got another question here as well for you. So do you feel the landscape's changed since Callum was at school for better or worse? And this question came from a GP, and she says in GP they're seeing quite a lot of disabled children being made to trial mainstream. Essentially, these kids are non-verbal in nappies, and parents need to keep them in prams, you know, to contain them. So how is a mainstream setting also going to keep them safe? So it's slightly different from what we're talking about, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I was in a meeting last year and talking about keeping them in pushchairs. I was in a meeting last year and I was told that the NHS in the previous school year had 2,500 requests for specially adapted pushchairs with straps to keep children contained in school. I don't think that that's a solution. That worries me greatly, because we're already seeing the use of chairs with straps, and we're asking the NHS to provide pushchairs with straps to contain children. I think, I've already said that I think that for some mainstream schools, the teachers are doing a really good job. But it comes down to the training, Natalie. Yeah. If the Scottish Government have this presumption to mainstream, I think that comes from a good place. However, if your staff in mainstream don't understand how to love and care for disabled children, that's not going to be the best environment for that child. And that is exactly the environment that will end up using coercive control, holding children down, putting them into isolation rooms with the door closed. But I think special schools have got a lot to answer for as well, because you would think that they should have the training to be able to prevent these incidents. But without the amount of ASN teachers that we don't have any longer in this country, the numbers have fallen significantly.
And the demand's going up and the numbers are falling, which makes no sense at all.
Your demand is up. The children are becoming more and more distressed, but yet we've not supported the staff. They don't have the training, they don't have the skills, they don't have the expertise to do the job that they've been asked to do.
Yeah.
And we wonder why we've got a problem.
I have no words. I've got one more question here for you. What do you think about current safe restraint training being taught to those in education and young person services? We may have covered some of this already, but these were some questions people had asked me to ask you.
So, for transparency, I am on the board of Restraint Reduction Network in the UK. I'm also a founding member of Restraint Reduction Scotland. And what I would like to see is not blanket restraint training. I think that in some settings, possibly in secure care, possibly in mental health settings, possibly in some schools, it may be beneficial to have some staff who are trained in safe holds. Remember what I said about, holding a child back if they're going to jump into the road.
Yeah.
Or, by the principle of last resort, right? Yeah. And I don't think that anybody should be doing that unless they've got some kind of training. The problem is the kind of training and the quality of that training. We've got to make sure that if we're going to train staff in using physical intervention, that the training is accredited. There's only one organisation in the UK that does this, and it's the Restraint Reduction Network. And it's very, 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 very stringent, the accreditation criteria. There are training organisations out there operating in Scotland who are training staff in schools, and there is no accreditation. And that is really worrying. Yeah. So we've got to make sure that the training that is there, if it's needed, is accredited by the right body. Otherwise, we're opening up a huge can of worms that's going to compromise children even more than they already are.
Well, I think that we could sit all day and talk about this, Beth. Honestly, it's a pleasure to speak to you. Like I said, you must be exhausted because that's 15 years. And obviously it's not just Callum's story. You take on so many other people's story and do your training, and it must be burn you out at times, but I admire you, and I'm sure lots of other people will. Your story's horrendous. It should never have happened. But thank goodness for you keeping going and fighting for all these children to make sure that this gets, I don't know what the word is, it shouldn't even be happening.
I think if I have to get a crown as big as Galinda's from Wicked, I will. Please, if you're watching this, please support us. Please help us make sure that what happened to Callum stops happening for children, because it is happening. It's horrific.
And people can support you with the hashtag support Callum's Law, Callum's Law, and get your crown on, or if you're like me, your glasses.
Yes, but you do have a picture, Natalie.
I do have one. I have done a picture. Yeah, but it's on social media, so I have done it. But today I was like, oh no, it's like
so. Yeah, please get those crowns on. Mums, dads, grannies, granddads, aunties, uncles, brothers and sisters, wear that crown to support children like Callum. Please, it's the right thing to do. And you know, I really don't want to come on here without thanking Daniel Johnson, MSP, because Daniel will tell you he has ADHD himself. And Daniel is the right person to take this campaign forward for his members' bill. He very kindly offered to do this. It's a lot of work. We have got, we passed the first stage, excuse me, in that we have managed to get the signatures from all parties. So we've got cross-party support. The ball is now in the court of the Scottish Government to see what's going to happen next. However, I worry that we've got an election coming up next year, so the priority is not going to be our children. The priority is going to be on the election campaign. Daniel has already promised me that, you know, he's sticking with us. He's going to see this through. And I'm very grateful for that, because there's not very many people who do the work that he's done and understand the things that he has had to come to an understanding of to bring this campaign forward. So thank you so much to Daniel. You know, he's the one that's had to put up with me sending him all these pictures of folk wearing their crowns.
Is he wearing a crown?
No, yeah. No, I have sent him one. I even sent him a blue one. But no, so far he's not done it. But, you know, please get your crowns on. Support us and help us to do the right thing.
Well, thank you so much, Beth. It's been a pleasure, and I am in full support, and so is our campaign of Callum's Law. And I hope everybody watching gives you a wee follow. And I think even just listening to your story today would make people have a bit more of an understanding of exactly what Callum's Law is. So thanks again, Beth.
Thank you. You take care, Natalie.
You too.
Right. Cheers.
Thanks, Beth.